in 1753. It was a while ago. An ambitious and impetuous 21-year-old officer in the Virginia militia led an ill-advised foray of colonial soldiers and Native Americans into French-controlled Ohio territory, initiating the first engagement in the French and Indian War. Overmatched in both numbers and in skill, the inexperienced officer was quickly trapped and forced to surrender his entire force just outside of what is now called Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. The Virginia militia reorganized the regiment in preparation for the coming war, but rather than accept a demotion for his reckless behavior, the proud young officer resigned his royal commission, shirking wartime service until offered a role as an aide-de-camp to a British general 9 months later. Like most who grew up in the United States, I studied first in elementary school, then again in middle school, and then again in high school, how our nation came to be, including the immeasurable contributions of many of those who founded this great country. However, in my schools, we rarely studied how the people who founded our nation came to be who they were. And so I was very surprised to learn later in life that George Washington, famed for his humility, patience, and thoughtfulness, lost his command and sparked a 9-year war between Britain and France through the pride and ambition of his youth. You see, George Washington wasn't born a humble man. Instead, he learned humility the hard way, much like the protagonist of this week's Parsha, the first in the book of Exodus, Parsha Shemot. When we first meet Moses as an adult, he behaves pretty rashly. You could even say arrogantly. The first thing we see him do is witness an Egyptian striking a Hebrew. His response? He kills the man and buries his body in the sand. Next, he finds 2 of his fellow Hebrews fighting, and he questions them, earning their scorn. However, after he has to escape for his life to Midian, after his marriage to Sipporah, after the birth of his eldest son, and after years of service as a shepherd to his father-in-law's flocks, the impetuousness and pride of Moses' youth gives way to humility. Thus, when God appears to Moses in the wilderness and orders him to go to Pharaoh, Moses responds reluctantly. Mi anochi ki elech el paro, v'chi otzi et bnei Yisrael mi Mitzrayim. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should free the people Israel from Egypt? Clearly, Moses does not feel up to the monumental task set before him. He continues by telling God all the reasons why sending him would be an awful idea. The people won't recognize God. The people won't trust Moses. Moses has a speech impediment. The list goes on. Ultimately, perhaps because God is God, or maybe because Moses is Moses, Moses obliges. But at the root of his reticence lies a truth so beguiling in its simplicity, and yet so difficult for so many of us to acknowledge and incorporate into our everyday lives. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should free the people Israel from Egypt? Who am I? Who am I to speak when so many others have so much to offer? Who am I to teach when I still have so much yet to learn? Who am I to tell my children the difference between right and wrong when I don't always know it myself? Who am I to stand here and share my thoughts with you when the teachings of our tradition are 3,000 years old? Every day, we are beset by challenges beyond our capacities. And if we're honest with ourselves, then we know that our records as parents, as children, as siblings, as spouses, as citizens, as leaders in business and in our communities, are littered with failures and missteps. We're simply not up to the monumental tasks that have been asked of us. But that doesn't make us defective. It makes us human. Too often we associate acknowledging our shortcomings with shame. We mistake doubt for insecurity, humility for humiliation. Even the Hebrew word for humility, anava, is derived from the root anav, which refers to those who are oppressed or exploited by those more powerful than them. And in our made-for-media world, one increasingly filled with bluster and conceit, it can seem so easy to think that admitting our inadequacies makes us weak. But there's no shame in admitting that we're not ready-made for the moments we are called upon to meet. That's a strength, one that ultimately paves our path toward success. After all, if we cannot admit our own shortcomings, our own mistakes, our own imperfections, then how are we ever supposed to grow beyond them? As longtime blogger Tim Urban thoughtfully writes, humility is a permeable filter that absorbs life experience and converts it into knowledge and wisdom. Arrogance, on the other hand, is a rubber shield that life simply bounces off of. It's no coincidence that the greatest prophet of our tradition felt insufficient for the task. Just as it's no coincidence that the first and perhaps greatest president in our nation's history remarked, upon being asked to command the Continental Army in 1775, "I do not think myself equal to the command I am honored with." It's in part because they acknowledge their inadequacies that Moses and later George Washington succeeded so historically at the Herculean tasks set before them. They didn't need to appear ready for whatever challenge came their way. They needed to grow into those challenges, mistake by mistake, lesson by lesson. And so must we. If we are to succeed at the daunting challenges that lay before us, as individuals, as a community, and as a people, then we must learn to embrace our own inadequacies. And we must discover and appreciate the benefits of being wrong. One of my favorite stories involves the Hasidic legend, the Baal Shem Tov, who held a yearly competition to select the very best shofar blower for his Rosh Hashanah service. But if you wanted to blow the shofar for the Baal Shem Tov, not only did you have to blow the shofar with gusto, making sure you could dazzle the likes of anyone who came to pray, you also had to learn a vast array of kavanot, quiet, complex prayers said before each blast of the shofar to direct the blast to the proper place in the divine realm. Prospective shofar blowers practice these kavanot, sometimes for months, sometimes for years, before auditioning before the Baal Shem Tov. When one such man came before the great Rabbi, he realized that none of his preparations had adequately equipped him to stand and to perform this ritual. So he choked. His mind froze. He couldn't remember the kavanot. He stood before the Baal Shem Tov in utter silence, and once he had realized just how egregiously he had failed, he started to cry. "All right," said the Baal Shem Tov, "you're hired." What the Baal Shem Tov was trying to teach that shofar blower and was trying to share with all of us is that coming up short represents the first step on the path to our greatest successes. but only if we're humble enough to admit it. Only by acknowledging our inadequacies with sincerity can we hope to lead ourselves, our families, our communities, and our people from Egypt and into the future that awaits. May this be the blessing we give ourselves and our community on this Shabbat. Shabbat Shalom.